Hello, this is SleepGTube, where stories are read for relaxation. Find some peace or rest. But before that, please take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you like what I do here. Story 1. Wicked Captain Warshaw of Walling. Written by Joseph Sheridan Lufani. A very old thing happened to my uncle, Mr. Watson of Haddlestone, and to enable you to understand it, I must begin at the beginning. In the year 1822, Mr. James Warshaw, more commonly known as Captain Warshaw, died at the age of 81 years. Captain in his early days, and so long as health and strength permitted, was a scamp of the active, intriguing sort. Spent his days and nights in sowing his wild oats, which he seemed to have exhaustible stock. The harvest of this village was plentiful, interspersed with thorns, nettles, and thistles, which stung the husbandman pleasantly and did not enrich him. Captain Warshaw was very well known in the neighborhood of Walling, and very generally avoided there. A captain by courtesy, for he had never reached that rank in the army list. He had quitted the service in 1766 at the age of 25, immediately previous to which period his debts had grown so troublesome that he was induced to extricate himself by running away with the marrying Iris. Though not so wealthy quite as he had imagined, she proved very uncomfortable investment for what remained of his shattered affection, and he lived and enjoyed himself very much in his old way, upon her income getting into no end of scrapes and scandals, and a good deal of debt and money trouble. When he married his wife, he was quartered in Ireland, at Clonal, and was a nunnery, in which as pensioner resided Miss O'Neill, or as she was called the country, Peg O'Neill, the Iris of whom I have spoken. Her situation was the only ingredient of romance in the affair, for the young lady was decidedly plain, though good-humoured looking, with that style of features which is termed potato, and figure she was a little too plump, and rather short, but she was impressible, and the handsome young English lieutenant was too much for her non-monastic tendencies, and she eloped. In England there are traditions of Irish fortune hunters, and in Ireland of English. The fact is, with the vagant class of each country that chiefly visited other in old times, and a handsome vagabond, whether at home or abroad, I suppose, made the most of his face, which was also his fortune. At all events, he carried off the fair one from the sanctuary, and for some sufficient reason, I suppose they took up their abode at Walling in Lancashire. Here the gallant captain amused himself after his fashion, sometimes running up, of course, on business, to London. I believe few wives have ever cried more in a given time than did that poor, dumpy, potato-faced Iris, who got over the nunnery garden wall, and jumped into the handsome captain's arms, for love. He spent her income, frightened her out of her wits with oaths and threats, and broke her heart. Latterly, she shut herself up pretty nearly altogether in her room. She had an old, rather grim Irish servant woman in attendance upon her. This domestic was tall, lean, and religious, and the captain knew instinctively she hated him, and he hated her in return. Often threatened to put her out of the house, sometimes even to kick her out of the window. And whenever a wet day confined him to the house or the stable, and he grew tired of smoking, he would begin to swear and curse at her for a diddled old mischief maker. They could never be easy, and was always troubling the house with her cursed stories, and so forth. But years passed away, and old Molly Doyle remained still in her original position. Perhaps he thought that there must be somebody there, and that it was not, after all, very likely to change for the better. Chapter 2. The Blessed Candle. He tolerated another intrusion, too, and thought himself a paragon of patience and easy good nature for so doing. Roman Catholic clergyman, in a long black frock, with a low standing collar, and a little white muslin fillet round his neck, tall, sallow, with blue chin and dark steady eyes. He used to glide up and down the stairs, and through the passages, and the captain sometimes met him in one place and sometimes in another. But by a caprice incident to such tempers he treated this Slary exceptionally, and even with a surly sort of courtesy, though he grumbled about his visits behind his back. I do know how that he had a great deal of moral courage, and the ecclesiastic looked severe and self-possessed, and somehow he thought he had no good opinion of him, and if natural occasion were offered, might say extremely unpleasant things, and hard to be answered. Well, the time came at last when poor Peg O'Neill, in evil hours Miss James Warshaw, must cry, and quake, and pray her last. The doctor came from Pendleton, and was just as vague as usual, but more gloomy, and for about a week came and went oftener. The cleric in the long black frock was also daily there, and at last came the last sacrament in the gates of death, when the sinner is traversing those dread steps that never can be retracted, when the face is turned forever from life, and we see in receding shape, and hear a voice already invocably in the land of spirits. So the poor lady died, and some people said the captain felt it very much. I don't think he did, but he was not very well just then, and looked the part of mourner and penitent to admiration, being seedy and sick. Drank a great deal of brandy and water that night. Called in Farmer Dobbs for want of better company. Drank with him. Told him all his grievances. How happy he had the poor lady upstairs. Might have been if it hadn't been for the liars and pick-thanks and tale-bearers and the like who came between them. Meaning Molly Doyle, whom, as he waxed eloquent over his liquor, he came to at last curse and rail by name, more than his accustomed freedom. He described his own natural character and ability in such moving terms that he wept maudlin tears, sensibility over his esteem, and when Dobbs was gone, drank some more grog, took to a railing, cursing again by himself, then mounted the stairs unsteadily, to see what the devil Doyle and the other old witches were about in poor Peg's room. When he pushed open the door, he found some half-dozen cronies, chiefly Irish, from the neighboring town of Hackleton, sitting over tea and snuff, etc. Candles lighted around the courts, which was arrayed in a strangely cut robe of brown serge. She had secretly belonged to some order, I think the Carmelite, but I am not certain, and wore the hat in her coffin. "What the are you doing with my wife?" cried the captain, rather thickly. "How dare you dress her up in this trumpery? You cheating old witch! And what's that candle doing in her hand?" I think he was a little startled, for the spectacle was grisly enough. The dead lady was arrayed in a strange brown robe, and her frigid fingers in a socket, the large wooden beads and cross wound round it. Burned a wax candle, shedding its white light over the sharp features of the corpse. Moll Doyle was not to be put down by the captain, whom she hated, and accordingly, in her phrase, he got good as by his gave. And the captain's wrath waxed fiercer, and he chucked the wax taper from the dead hand, was on point of flinging it at the old serving woman's head. "The holy candle, you sinner!" cried she. "I've a mind to make you eat it, you beast!" cried the captain. But I think he had not known before what it was, for it subsided a little sulkily, and he stuffed his hand with the candle, quite extinct by this time, into his pocket, and said he, "You know devilish well you had no business going on with your witchcraft about my poor wife without my leave. You always take off that brown pinafore and get her decently into her coffin, and I'll pitch your devil's waxlight into the sink." And the captain stalked out of the room. "And now her poor soul's in prison, you wretch. Be the man o' you, and manner be shut in the wick o' the same candle till it's burned out, you savage. I'd have you duck for a witch for 2 pence," roared the captain for the staircase and his hand on the banister standing on the lobby. But the door to the chamber of death clapped angrily, and he went down to the parlor, where he examined the holy candle for a while, with the tipsy gravity, and with something of that feeling of the symbolic, which is not uncommon in rakes and scamps. Doubtfully thought it up in a press, where he accumulated all sorts of obsolete rubbish, soiled packs of cards, disused tobacco pipes, broken powder plas, heaped military swords, and a dusky bundle of the Flash songster, and other questionable literature. He did not trouble the dead lady's room any more. Being a volatile man, it was probable that more cheerful plans and occupation began to entertain her fancy. Chapter 3. My Uncle Watson Visits Wallen. So the poor lady was buried decently, and the Captain Warshaw reigned alone for many years at Wallen, who was too shrewd and too experienced by the time to run violently down the steep hill that leads to ruin. So there was a method in his madness, and after a widowed career of more than 40 years, he, too, died at the last with some guineas in his purse. 40 years and upwards is a great aid extra and a wonderful chemical power. It acted forcibly upon the gay Captain Warshaw. Gout supervened, and was no more conducted with temper and enjoyment. It made his elegant hands lumpy at all the small joints, turned them slowly into crippled claws. He grew stout when the exercise was interfered with, and ultimately almost corpulent. He suffered from what Mr. Holloway called bad legs, and was wheeled about in a great leathern black chair, and infirmities went on accumulating with his years. I am sorry to say I never heard that he repented, or turned his thoughts seriously to the future. On the contrary, his talk grew fouler, and his fun ran about his favorite sins, and his temper waxed more truculent. But he did not sink into dotage concerning his bodily infirmities. His energies and his malignancies, which were many and active, were marvelously little abated by time. So he went on to close when his temper was stirred. He cursed and swore in a way that sent people to tremble. It was a word and a blow with him. The latter, luckily, not very sure now, but he would seize his crutch, make a swoop or a pound at the offender, or shy his medicine bottle, or his tumbler at his head. It was a particularity of Captain Warshaw that he, by this time, hated nearly everybody. My uncle, Mr. Watson of Handleston, was cousin to the captain in his area-law, but my uncle had lent him money on the mortgage of his estates, and there had been a treaty to sell, and terms and a price were agreed upon, and articles which the lawyers had said were still in force. I think the ill-conditioned captain bore him a grudge for being richer than he, and would have liked to do him ill turn, but he did not lie in his way, at least while he was living. My Uncle Watson was a Methodist, and what they call a class leader, and on for a close, very good man. He was now near 50, grave, seemed his profession somewhat dry, and a little severe, perhaps, but a man. A letter from the Pendleton doctor reached him at Handlestone, announcing the death of the wicked old captain, suggesting his attendance at the funeral. Expensive being the spot to look after things a while. Reasonableness of the striking my good uncle, he made his journey to the old house in Lancashire, continently, and reached it in time for the funeral. My uncle, whose traditions of the captain were derived from his mother, remembered him in his slim, handsome youth, shorts, cocked lace, was amazed at the bulk of the coffin which contained his moral remains, but the lid being already screwed down, he did not see the face of the bloated old sinner. Chapter 5. In the Parlor. What I relate, I had from the lips of my uncle, who was a truthful man, not prone to fancies. The day turning out awfully rainy and tempestuous, he persuaded a doctor and attorney to remain for the night at Wallen. There was no will, the attorney was served at, for the captain's amenities were perpetually shifting, and he could never quite make up his mind as to how best to give effect of malignity, whose direction was constantly being modified. He had instructions for drawing a will a dozen times over, but the process had always been arrested by the intending testator. Search being made, no will was found. The papers indeed were all right, with one important exception. The leases were nowhere to be seen. These were special circumstances connected with several of the principal tenancies on this estate, unnecessary here to detail, which rendered the loss of these documents one of very serious moment and even very obvious danger. My uncle therefore searched strenuously. The attorney was at his elbow, and the doctor helped with suggestion now and then. The old serving man seemed an honest deaf creature, and really knew nothing. My Uncle Watson was very much perturbed. He fancied, but this possibly was only fancy, that he had detected for a moment a queer look in the attorney's face, and from that instant it became fixed in his mind that he knew all about the leases. Mr. Watson expounded that evening in the parlor to the doctor, the attorney, and the deaf servant. Ananias and Sapphira figured out in the foreground and the awful nature of fraud and theft, tampering in any wise, that the plain rule of honesty in matters pertaining to estates, etc., were pointedly dwelt upon. And then came a long strenuous prayer, in which he entreated with a fervor and aplomb that had heart of the sinner who had abstracted the leases might be softened or broken in such a way as to lead to their restitution, or that, if he continued reserved and contumacious, if it might at least be the will of heaven to bring him into public justice and the documents to light. The fact is that he was praying all this time at the attorney. When these religious exercises were over, the visitors retired to their rooms, and my Uncle Watson wrote 2 or 3 pressing letters by the fire. When his task was done, it had grown late. The candles were flaring in their sockets, and all in bed, and I suppose asleep but he. The fire was nearly out, he chilly in the flame, and the candles throbbing strangely in their sockets, shed alternate glare in the shadow around the old wainscot room and the quiet furniture. Outside were all the wild thunder and piping of the storm, and the rattling of the distant windows sounded through the passages, down the stairs like angry people astir in the house. My Uncle Watson belonged to a section who by no means rejected the supernatural, and whose founder, on the contrary, has sanctioned ghosts in the most sympathetic way. He was glad, therefore, to remember that in the prosecuting his search that day, he had seen some 6 inches of wax candles in the press in the parlor, for he had no fancy to be overtaken by darkness in his present situation. He had no time to lose, and taking a bunch of keys, of which he was now master, he soon fitted the lock and secured the candle, a treasure in his circumstances, in lighting it. He stuffed it into the socket of one of the expiring candles and extinguishing the other, He had looked around the room in the steady light, reassured. At the same moment, an unusual violent gust of the storm blew a handful of gravel against the parlor window, with a sharp rattle that startled him in the midst of the roar and hubbub, and the flame of the candle itself was agitated by the air. Chapter 5. The Bedchamber. My uncle walked up to the bed, guarding his candle with his hand, for the lobby windows were rattling furiously, and he disliked the idea of being left in the dark more than ever. His bedroom was comfortable, though old-fashioned. He shut and bolted the door. There was a tall-looking glass opposite the foot of his four-poster on the dressing table between the windows. He tried to make the curtains meet, but they would not draw, and like many, a gentleman in a like perplexity. He did not possess a pin, nor was there one in the huge percussion beneath the glass. He turned the face of the mirror away, therefore, so that its back was presented to the bed, pulled the curtains together, and placed a chair against them, to prevent them from falling open again. There was a good fire and a reinforcement of brown coal wood inside the fender, so he piled it up to ensure a cheerful blaze through the night, placing a little black mahogany table with the legs of satire beside the bed, candle upon it, hid between the sheets, and laid his red nightcapped head upon his pillow, disposed himself to sleep. The first thing that made him uncomfortable was a sound at the foot of his bed, quite distinct in momentary hull of the storm. It was only the gentle rustle and rush of the curtains, which fell open again, and his eyes opened. He assumed there was perpendicular dependence and sat up in his bed, almost expecting to see something uncanny in the aperture. There was nothing, however, but the dressing table and other dark furniture, the window curtains faintly undulating in the violence of the storm. He did not care to get up, therefore, the fire being bright and cheery, to replace the curtains by a chair, in the position which he had left them, anticipating possibly a new recurrence of the relapse which had startled him from the insipidence dose, so he got to sleep in a little while again. But he was disturbed by a sound, as he fancied, at the table on which stood the candle. He could not say what it was, only that he was awakened with a start, and lying so in some amaze. He did distinctly hear a sound which startled him a good deal, though there was nothing necessarily supernatural in it. He described it as resembling what would occur if you fancied a finished table leaf with a convex warp in it, depressed the reverse way, and suddenly with the spring recovering its natural convexity. It was a loud, sudden thump, which made the heavy candlestick jump, and there was an end, except that my uncle did not get again into a doze for 10 minutes at least. The next time he awoke, it was in that odd, serene way that sometimes occurs. We open our eyes, we know why, not quite, placidly, and are on the instant wide awake. We had napped some duration this time, for his candle flame was fluttering and flaring, an articulo, silver socket, but the fire was still bright and cheery, so he popped the extinguisher on the socket, and almost at the same time, there came a tap at his door, and a sort of crescendo hush. Once more my uncle was sitting up, scared and perturbed in his bed. He recollected, however, that I had bolted his door, and such enervated materialists are in the midst of our spiritualism. That had reassured him. He breathed a deep sigh and began to grow tranquil. But after a rest of a minute or two, there came a louder and sharper knock at his door, so that instinctively he called out, "Who's there?" in a loud, stern key. There was no sort of response, however. The nervous effect of the start subsided, and I think my uncle must have remembered how constantly, especially on a stormy night, these creaks or cracks which simulate all manner of goblin noises make themselves naturally audible. Chapter 6. The extinguisher is lifted. After a while, then he lay down with his back turned toward that of the side bed at which was the door, and his face toward the table on which stood the massive old candlestick, capped with his extinguisher, and in that position he closed his eyes, but sleep would not revisit them. All kinds of queer fancies began to trouble him. Some of them I remember. He felt the point of a finger, he averred, pressed most distinctly on the tip of his great toe, as if a living hand were between the sheets and making a sort of a signal of attention, of silence. Then again he felt something as large as a rat make a run bounce in the middle of the bolster, just under his head. Then a voice said, "Oh," very gently, close at the back of his head. All these things he felt certain of, and the investigation led to nothing. He felt odd little cramps stealing now and then about him, and then on a sudden middle finger of his right hand was plucked backwards, with a light playful jerk that frightened him awfully. Meanwhile, the storm kept singing and howling, and ha-hooing hoarsely among the limbs of the old trees and the chimney pots. Uncle Watson, although he prayed and meditated as was his wont, when he lay awake, felt his heart throb excitedly. Sometimes, though, he was beset with evil spirits, and at others he was in the early stage of a fever. He resolutely kept his eyes closed, however, and like St. Paul's shipwrecked companions wished for the day, at last another little doze seemed to have stolen upon his senses, for he awoke quietly and completely as before, opening his eyes all at once, seeing everything as if he had not slept for a moment. The fire was still blazing red, nothing uncertain in the light. The massive silver candlestick, topped with its tall extinguisher, stood on the center of the black mahogany table as before, and looking what seemed to be a sudden accident to the apex of this, he beheld something which made him quite misdoubt the evidence of his eyes. He saw the extinguisher lifted by a tiny hand from beneath, and a small human face, no bigger than a thumbnail, nicely proportioned features peeped from beneath. This Lilliputian countenance was such a ghastly consternation, horrified my uncle unspeakably. Out came a little foot then and there, and a pair of wee legs, in short silk stockings and buckled shoes, then the rest of the figure, and the arms holding out about the socket. The little legs stretched and stretched, hanging about the stem of the candlestick, till the feet reached the base, and so down the starter-like leg of the table, still they reached on the floor, extending elastically, strangely enlarging in all proportions as they approached the ground, where the feet and buckles were those of all-shaped, full-grown men, and the figure tapering upward until it dwindled to its original fairy dimensions at the top, like an object seen in some strangely curved mirror. Standing upon the floor, he expanded, my amazed uncle could not tell now, into his proper proportion, and stood pretty nearly into a profile, besides a handsome and elegantly shaped young man, in a bygone military costume with a small lace, three-cocked and hat plume on his head, but looking like a man going to hanged in unspeakable despair. He stepped lightly to the hearth, turned for a few seconds, very dejectedly with his back toward the bed and mantelpiece, and he saw the hilt of his rapier glittering in the firelight. And then walking across the room, he had placed himself at the dressing table, visible through the divided curtains at the foot of the bed. The fire was blazing still so brightly that my uncle saw him indistinctly, as if half a dozen candles were burning. Chapter 7. The Visitation Culminates. The looking-glass was an old-fashioned piece of furniture and had a drawer beneath it. My uncle had searched it carefully for the papers in the daytime, but the silent figure pulled the drawer quite out, pressed a spring at the side of this, closing a false receptacle behind it, and from this I drew a parcel of papers tied together with pink tape. All this time my uncle was staring at him in a horrified state, neither winking nor breathing, and apparition had once not given the smallest intimation or consciousness that a living person was in the same room. But now, for the first time, it turned its livid stare full upon my uncle with a hateful smile of significance, lifting up the little parcel of papers between his slender finger and thumb. Then he made a long, cunning wink at him, seemed to blow one of his cheeks in a burlesque grimace which, but for the horrific circumstances, would have been ludicrous. My uncle could not tell whether this was really an intentional distortion or only one of those horrid ripples of deflections which were constantly disturbing the proportions of the figure, as if it were seen through some unequal and perverting medium. The figure now approached the bed, seeming to grow exhausted and malignant as it did so. My uncle's terror nearly culminated at this point, or he believed it was drawn near him with an evil purpose. But it was not so, for the soldier, over whom 20 years seemed to have passed, in his brief transit to the dressing table and back again, threw himself into a great high-backed armchair, stuffed leather at the far side of the fire, and placed his heels on the fender. His feet and legs seemingly indistinctly to swell, and swathing showed themselves round and grew into something enormous, and the upper figure swayed and shaped itself in the corresponding proportions. A great mass of corpulence, with a cadaverous and malignant face, furrows of a great old age, and colorless glassy eyes, and with these changes, which came indefinitely but rapidly as those of a sunset cloud, the fine regimentals faded away, and a loose gray, woolly drapery somehow was there instead. It all seemed to be stained and rotten, for swarms of worms seemed creeping in and out, while the figure grew paler and paler till my uncle, who liked his pipe, and employed the similar naturally, and the whole infantry grew to the color of tobacco ashes, and the clusters of worms into little wriggling knots of sparks, such as we see running over the residuum of the burnt sheet of paper. And so, with the strong jolt caused by the fire and the curtain of air from the window which was rattling in the storm, the feet seemed to be drawn into the fireplace. The whole figure, light as ashes, floated away with them, disappeared with a whisk of the capacious old chimney. It seemed to my uncle that the fire suddenly darkened and the air grew icy cold. There came an awful roar and riot of tempest which shook the old house from the top to base, and sounded like the yelling of a bloodthirsty mob receiving a new, long-expected victim. Good Uncle Watson used to say, "I've been in many situations of fear and danger in the course of my life, but never did I pray with so much agony before or since, for then, as now, it was clear beyond cavil that I had actually upheld the phantom of an evil spirit." Conclusion. Now there are two curious circumstances to be observed in the relation of my uncle's, who was, as I have said, a perfectly voracious man. First, the wax candle which he had took from the press in the parlor and burnt at his bedside on the horrible night was unquestionably, accordingly to the testimony of the old deaf servant, had been 50 years of walling, that identical piece of holy candle, which had stood in the fingers of the poor lady's corpse, and concerning which the old Irish crone, long since dead, had delivered a curious curse I have mentioned against the captain. Secondly, behind the drawer under the looking-glass, he did actually discover a second but secret drawer, in which were concealed the identical papers which he had suspected the attorney of having made away with. There were circumstances, too, afterwards disclosed with the convinced my uncle that old man had deposited them there, preparatory to burning them, which he had nearly made in his mind to do. Now, a very remarkable ingredient in which this tale of Uncle Watson was this. It was so far as my father, who had never seen Captain Warshaw in the course of his life, could gather. The phantom had exhibited a horrible, grotesque, but unmistakable resemblance to the defunct scamp in the voracious stages of his long life. Walling was sold in this year 1837, and the old house shortly after pulled down, and a new one built near to the river. I often wondered whether it was rumored to be haunted, and, if so, what stories were current about it. It was a commodious and stanch old house, withal rather handsome, and demolition was certainly suspicious. Yeah.